Hey, what's up? David Chapman here with Designs for Church. Today I want to walk you through a promo I worked on for Lakewood announcing their guest speaker lineup. I'll show you how I animated the text drawing on, the sliding transition between speakers, and that multi-screen zoom in at the very beginning. I've also made some really handy presets that I want to share. They're going to make animating text and shape layers super easy. You'll find a link to download them in the description below. All right, let's jump in. I've already created a composition named Speaker 1. It's 1920 by 1080, 23.976 frames per second, and I made it 10 seconds long to cover the maximum duration a speaker would be on screen, though most will only be 5 to 6 seconds. Once I get this first composition animated, I'll just duplicate it and make the text changes for the other speakers. In this comp, I have 3 text layers and a still frame to represent the video. I can replace the still image later on with the actual video. I'm going to start by animating that drawing on effect, and I did that with trim paths. But first, I need some paths to animate. I'll right-click the text layer and select Create Shapes from Text. This makes a new shape layer with paths from the original text, and it also disables the text layer below. Now, if I twirl down the shape layer, I can see all the shapes that were made from each letter. To adjust the look, I'm going to click on the word Fill and disable it. Then click on the word Stroke and select Solid. And then set the stroke to 6 pixels. Now normally I would click the little Add menu and add a Trim Paths effect, set keyframes to animate the path over time, easy ease those keyframes, and even go into the graph editor and refine the movement. So instead of all that, I've made an animation preset that takes care of these steps for me with all the settings I typically use. I'll move the playhead to the beginning, and with the shape layer still selected, I'll open the Effects and Presets panel, open Animation Presets where I have my DC Presets folder. I'll double-click the preset named Trim Paths. Immediately, Trim Paths is applied, along with a keyframed animation. I even have a slider in the effects controls that I can use to change the path offset without having to dive into the Trim Paths options deep inside the layer. I can hit U and drag out the last keyframe to lengthen the animation or shorten it. I also used the original text layer to add a flicker as the lines are drawing on, giving it a bit more depth than the Trim Paths alone. I'll select and turn on the original text layer and press T for opacity and set the value to 50%. I'm going to add a simple expression here by option clicking the stopwatch, opening the expression editor. I'll type in wiggle, parentheses, followed by 2 numbers separated by a comma. The first number will be speed, so how many times per second. I'll type in 100, so 100 times per second, then a comma, and the next number will be value, or how much it will change. I'll type in 60 and click outside to exit editing. So now 100 times per second, the opacity will change randomly up to 60% in either direction. As I play through, you can see the layer is now flashing with random values. I'll scrub through to find a good section of flashing and press Option left bracket to trim the beginning of the layer. Now I'll find a point in time where the flicker looks like it builds and cuts off. Here, I'll press Option right bracket to trim the end. Now I'll position the end of the clip to align with the second keyframe of the trim paths above. There we go, that looks pretty good. Next, I'm going to animate the date with the help of another DC preset. I'll move the playhead to the beginning, and with nothing selected in the timeline, I'll double-click Pro Shape X. This gives me a rectangular shape layer with an expression tying the anchor point along the X-axis, so horizontally, and some controllers for the shape layer that are available in the effects controls, so I can change the size without diving into the shape layer properties. I'll move it below the date layer and rename it to bar, and drag it on screen to align it under the text layer. I'll drag the slider for the width to get a size that looks good, and I'll go ahead and type in 120 for the height. I'll also change the color to blue. Now all I need to do is animate the scale. I'll hit S for scale, unlock the X and Y, and change the X value to 0, and then set a keyframe. I'll move ahead 30 frames and change the X value to 100. I'll select these keyframes and add an Easy Ease by right-clicking, selecting Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. With the keyframe still selected, I'll click this icon to open the graph editor. I'll select each side and drag the handle and make the shape a little sharper, favoring the right side. Now I'm holding Shift so I don't move the keyframes up and down. That movement looks pretty good. Now to have the bar reveal the text, I need to select the text layer and apply a Set Matte effect by going to Effect, Channel, Set Matte. By default, it sets the matte to itself, so I need to click on the drop-down menu and select the bar layer below. Now the text only shows wherever the bar is on screen. I'll move the bar and text ahead to the 1 second mark, so it begins after the text is outlined. Now I'll duplicate the bar a few times and drag the copies below. I'm going to position them so each one begins a few frames before the other. Now I'll change the middle bar to white and the bottom bar to a teal color. Now when I play back, we can see the bars stagger in. I also have some presets that animate text layers in with various options by character, by line, and by word. I also have a variation for random characters. These presets add a few keyframes, so I want to move the playhead back to the beginning. I'll select my name small layer and double-click Text in by Character Random. Various properties have been added into the Effects Controls panel, and if I hit U, there are keyframes for the start and end of the animation. But nothing is animating yet. The text is in its final position, but I need to make some adjustments to create its starting position. So I'll drag the vertical slider to move the text down slightly, and then I'll check the checkbox for opacity. Now when I play through, the text animates in smoothly. And if I decide I want the characters coming down instead of going up, I can check this checkbox for flip direction. Now they come in from the top. Okay, now that we have the main text animated, this speaker 1 comp is ready to go. The next step would be to duplicate this composition a few more times for however many speakers I need, and swap out the photo and edit the text to match. Alright, I've gone ahead and created a few more speaker comps so we can move on to make the transition. I'll create a new composition that's 1920 by 1080, the same frame rate, but this time I'm going to set the length to 60 seconds. And I'll go ahead and name it Promo. Now I'm going to add the speaker 1 comp into the timeline. I want to start transitioning to another speaker around the 5 second mark, so I'll move the playhead to 5 seconds, then duplicate our speaker 1 comp with Command or Control D and align it to the playhead. By the way, you can enable snapping by holding the Shift key. I'm going to select both layers and hit P for position and set a keyframe for both. I'll move ahead 20 frames and set another keyframe. Now in this second keyframe, I want the first speaker comp to move off to the left, so in the X value, I'll click in and just subtract the width of the comp, keeping the value of 960 and typing minus 1920 and hit return. You can now see this layer is moved off to the left. The second layer is already in the correct position, so I'll move back to the first keyframe. Here I want to move it off to the right, so I'll click inside the value and add 1920 and hit return. If we play through, both comps slide together, but I want to add an easy ease, so I'll select all the keyframes, right-click, and select Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. I'll jump into the graph editor and adjust each handle to make the curve a lot sharper. There we go, that looks pretty good. Now on the second layer, I want to grab the 2 keyframes and copy them. Then I'll drag the playhead to the beginning, select the first layer, and paste them. I don't need the second layer anymore, so I'll delete it. Now we have a single layer that slides on and slides off. I'll also trim the end of the layer to match up with the final keyframe. So now if we duplicate this layer, we can align the keyframes where they slide in and out in sequence. I'll duplicate one more so I have 3, and I can continue this process if I had many more speakers. I'm going to select the second layer, go up to the browser and grab speaker 2. While holding down Option, I'll drag it over the second layer and it will be replaced with speaker 2. I'll do the same to swap out our third layer with speaker 3. Now to add some bars to animate along with the transition. I'll move the playhead to the beginning of speaker 2. With nothing selected, I'm going to click back to the animation presets, and this time I'm going to click on Pro Shape X Full. This adds a full 1920 by 1080 size shape layer that has its anchor point aligned to the left edge. I'll hit S for scale and set a keyframe. I'll unlink the X and Y and set the value to 0. I'll then move ahead 10 frames and set the value to 100. It's sliding the wrong way, so I'll check the checkbox to flip horizontal, and then click on the Align panel and click on Right Align. And now it's snapped to the right side of the comp. Now I want to animate the position to move the shape off screen, but I don't want to use the layers position. If I twirl down the layer and open Contents and Rectangle 1, you'll notice it has its own transform control at the bottom. I'll open that up and set a keyframe on position, which should read 0, 0. I'll move ahead 10 frames and click inside the position X value and type minus 1920 and hit return. Now it's moved off to the left. I'll hit U to focus on just the keyframes, and then I'll go ahead and select all these keyframes and give them an easy ease. Now I'll jump into the graph editor again, and this time I want to adjust these values separately. It scales up first, so I'll select Scale, and I'll grab the left side and drag the handle all the way to the right so it eases in a ton at the beginning. Then I'll select the Position property and do the opposite, grabbing the handle on the right side and dragging all the way to the left, so it eases a ton as it's leaving the frame. This is what we have. Now I want to overlap the keyframes in the middle, so I'll drag the Position keyframe over to the left a few frames, and then the Scale keyframe and drag it over to the right a few keyframes. I'll also grab the keyframes at either end, so it begins 3 to 4 frames before the transition happens and ends 3 to 4 keyframes after. That's working a lot better now. Okay, so the reason I animated the position way inside the rectangle itself was to make it easier to duplicate this layer and freely move it up and down to a new position without messing up any keyframes. So first I'll change the name of this layer to Bar Wipe. I'll change the color to a shade of white. I'll also trim the beginning and end of the clip to the starting and ending keyframes. I'll move the playhead back to the middle of the transition and then duplicate the bar layer with Command or Control D. I'll change the color to a shade of blue, and then drag the height slider down to make the bar thinner. Now, holding Shift, I'll drag the layer up or down to move it to a new vertical position. And to change the timing, I'll slide the layer forward 1 frame. I'll duplicate this bar and move it up holding Shift. I'll then change the height slider, and then select a new color. Then I'll drag it back to change the timing of the layer. Maybe I'll duplicate one more, moving it ahead in time, adjust the position, the height, and the color. This time I'll hit U and select all the keyframes. If I hold on Option, I can drag the last keyframe, which stretches the keyframes out farther in time proportionally. I'll also have to extend the layer to cover the change, but now one of the bars is moving at a slightly different speed. You can play around quite a bit to get a lot of variety with these bars without a lot of hassle. To clean it up, I'm going to select these bars, right-click and select Pre-Compose. I'll name it Bar Wipe and make sure Adjust Comp Duration is set. Now I can duplicate this layer to move it around and cover the other transitions. But before I do, I'll move the playhead to align with the start of the transition and set a marker on the bar wipe layer either with the asterisk key on the number pad or by pressing Ctrl 8. Now I have a visual for where it needs to line up. I'll duplicate to make 2 copies and drag them over to align with the other speakers. Alright, the final part of this is the 3D multi-screen zoom in. I'll select our first speaker and enable the 3D switch to turn it into a 3D layer. I'm going to delete the first 2 keyframes so it doesn't start off screen. Next, I'll create a camera by right-clicking and selecting New, Camera. 50mm is fine, and I'll hit OK. I'll move the camera layer down right above our speaker layer. I'm going to move the playhead to the 4-second mark. This is where I want the camera to come to rest. I'll hit P on the camera layer and click the stopwatch to set a keyframe. I like to work backwards for movements like this, setting a final keyframe first and then moving the camera. Before I do, I'll trim the camera layer to end at this keyframe just for some visual cleanup. I'll move the playhead to the beginning, and then drag the Z value, holding Shift to move it in larger increments. I want enough room for the videos to fill the screen all around, and -7900 looks like a good even number. Now I need to make the other screens. I'll duplicate the Speaker 1 comp and rename it Screen 1, and hit P and delete the keyframes. Next I'll drag it over, and if I hold Command or Control on the PC, I can snap to align the corner of the video to the other. I'll duplicate the layer and move it over. I'll continue this process until I have enough copies around the main video. After we get this set up, we can easily swap them out with new comps. Okay, now that everything's aligned, I'll trim the ends off to match up with the camera layer. The camera movement's pretty slow, so I'll easy ease both keyframes of the camera and open up the graph editor. I'll grab the left keyframe and drag the handle all the way to the right. Now the camera very slowly gets going and then picks up speed towards the end. I want a different image in each of these screens, So I'll create a new composition, the same size and frame rate. I'll make it 10 seconds long, and I'll name it Screen 1. I'll duplicate this comp 7 more times since we need 8 screens in total. I'll open each one and drag in a photo, repositioning it as needed. So now that we have content in all 8 of our screen comps, I'll drag and replace our temporary comps, holding down Option as I drag to replace them. Okay, great. Now we have a different image in each comp. The animation on the text for the speaker starts too soon, so let's fix that. I'll move the playhead to where the camera comes to a rest and then double-click to jump inside the Speaker 1 comp. I'll grab all the layers above the background and move them to a few frames before the playhead. That should work. So now I'll jump back to the promo comp. I need some text, so I'll create a text layer and type "Coming in 2019." I'll change the alignment to center and then position it in the frame. Then I'll change the font size for 2019 and I'll adjust the leading. Now I need to make this text layer a 3D layer by clicking the 3D switch. I want the camera to fly through the text, so I'm going to move the playhead back to a point where I'd like the text to be behind the camera. Now I'll hit P for position, and holding Shift, I'm going to drag the Z slider until it's just off screen behind the camera. That looks pretty good. I'm going to add another preset to animate the text coming in on screen. I'll move the playhead to the beginning, and I'll come up to Effects and Presets and double-click Text in by Word. Now over in the Effects properties, I'll deselect everything and then drag down the vertical position to start slightly lower. Then I'll check the checkbox for opacity. There we go. Now I'm going to add a bit of a color grade to the screens, so I'll create a new adjustment layer by clicking Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and I'll rename it Grade. Next, I'll apply a tint effect under Effect, Color Correction, Tint. I'll change the white to a blue color. It's affecting the text layer, so I'll move it down right above the camera, and also bring down the text layer down to group it with the others. Now I want to animate the opacity for this adjustment layer to turn off the effect, so I'll move the playhead right to after the text moves off screen, and then hit T for opacity. I'll set a keyframe and set the value to 0. I'll move back 10 frames or so and set the value to 100. Now we're almost finished. I had some doors opening up revealing the scene, so let's make those real quick. I'll move the playhead to the beginning, and I'm going to pick another preset. With nothing selected in the timeline, I'm going to double-click ProShape X Full. Now this shape layer fills the screen, but I want the shape to be half as wide. So I'll click in the width slider and add the / for divide and the number 2, and it does the math for me, setting the value at 960. I'll hit S for scale and set a keyframe. Then I'll move ahead 10 frames, unlink the X and Y, and set the X value to 0. I'll easy ease the keyframes and then jump into the graph editor and drag to make both sides pretty sharp. Now I may want to drag the last keyframe out another frame or two if the movement's too fast. I'm going to change the color to white, and I'm going to rename this layer Door 1. I'm also going to trim the layer at the last keyframe. Now I'll duplicate the layer, come up and click the checkbox for Flip Horizontal, and then come over to the Align panel and click to align it to the right side instead of the left. Now we have our doors opening up. To clean up the layers, I'll drag the 2 door layers above the camera layer, and I'll trim the text layer and adjustment layers to match the others. One final tweak. Our first speaker isn't on screen long enough, so I'll move the playhead over to about 8 seconds. I'll select layer and hit P if I don't already see the position keyframes, and I'll drag them over to align the first keyframe with the playhead and extend the layer to match. Next, I'll grab all the layers above and slide them over so that marker on the transition aligns with the first keyframe down here. Now that the setup's done, I can swap out the photos for videos and slide the transitions around to best fit each section. Alright guys, that's it. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know down in the comments. And if you'd like to see more of these types of videos, let me know that too. Until next time, happy creating.